3 minutes ago, I made a decision that could no longer wait. There were no cameras in the room, no applause, no ceremony, just maps on the wall, reports on the table, and one truth sitting heavy in the air. Nigeria is bleeding, and while its people suffer, their leaders hesitate. So 3 minutes ago, I formed the alliance, not for politics, not for headlines, not for approval, but for protection. The silence before action. Let me speak plainly, because what follows requires no embellishment, no political language, no careful diplomacy. When borders collapse, chaos does not respect passports. When terror spreads, it does not ask for permission. When civilians are hunted, excuses do not save lives. For years now, Nigeria's people have endured what no nation should accept as normal. Villages erased overnight, their names becoming memorials instead of homes. Families displaced by the millions, carrying whatever they could grab as gunfire echoed behind them. Children growing up to the sound of gunfire instead of school bells, learning to recognize the difference between small arms and heavy weapons before they learn to read. And every time violence surges, every time bodies are counted, every time another community becomes a ghost town, the same script is read. Condemnations drafted by officials who will sleep safely tonight. Emergency meetings where the same people make the same statements. Foreign advisors arriving with recommendations written thousands of miles away. Promises of reform that somehow never materialize into protection. Yet the ground reality never changes, because when leadership becomes cautious, violence becomes confident. When governments hesitate, armed groups advance. When strategy becomes endless discussion, terrorism fills the vacuum with action. The human cost in numbers. The statistics tell a story that should shame the world. By the end of 2024, Nigeria hosted 3.5 million internally displaced persons, 3.5 million people, more than the entire population of many countries, driven from their homes by violence that shows no signs of abating. This represents the highest number of IDPs in all of West Africa, surpassing all neighboring countries combined. These aren't just numbers and reports. These are families torn apart, children traumatized, communities destroyed. In May 2025 alone, Nigeria recorded at least several hundred deaths from armed violence. The Global Terrorism Index 2025 ranks Nigeria sixth globally, sixth out of every nation on Earth, noting 565 deaths in 2024 from terrorism, alongside widespread banditry that the statistics barely capture because so many attacks go unreported in remote areas where government presence has effectively ceased to exist. The violence has become so pervasive, so normalized that we speak of it in regions and categories. In the northeast, Boko Haram and the Islamic State West Africa province wage insurgency that has killed tens of thousands since 2009. In the northwest, armed criminal bands called bandits engage in mass kidnappings, village raids, and highway attacks. In the Middle Belt, farmer-herder conflicts intensified by climate change and resource competition have killed thousands. In the southeast, separatist agitation and criminal violence create additional instability. This is not one crisis. This is multiple overlapping emergencies that have merged into a national security catastrophe. According to the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, escalating violence has caused fatalities linked to militant Islamist groups in Africa to surge by 60% since 2023, with Nigeria remaining one of the primary theaters of this bloodshed. While military casualties have decreased, suggesting security forces have learned to better protect themselves, civilian casualties have been steadily increasing. Over 4,000 civilians were killed in Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe states, the BAY states, alone in recent periods, representing a spike in violence marked by a 68% increase in fatalities involving civilians. Let those numbers sink in. While soldiers die less frequently, civilians die more frequently. While the military adapts and survives, the people they're meant to protect suffer and perish. The cross-border reality. I waited. We all waited. We waited for decisive action from Abuja. We waited for borders to be secured so that terrorism couldn't flow freely across colonial lines drawn a century ago that make no sense to people who live there. We waited for African solutions to African problems, for the day when Nigeria's enormous resources and potential would be marshaled effectively to protect its citizens. But waiting has a cost that gets paid in blood, and Nigeria's people have paid it for over a decade now. So understand this clearly. This alliance was not formed to embarrass anyone. It was not formed to undermine Nigeria's sovereignty or to suggest its military is incapable. It was formed because silence had become betrayal, because watching violence consume a neighboring nation while doing nothing is not neutrality, it is complicity. When a house is on fire and the owner argues about which hose to use while debating who gets credit for putting out the flames, the neighbors step in with buckets. This is that moment. The Lake Chad Basin crisis exemplifies why regional action cannot wait for perfect coordination. Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger share the Lake Chad region where Boko Haram and ISWAP operate with devastating effect. These groups don't respect borders. When pressure increases in northeastern Nigeria, they cross into Cameroon. When Cameroonian forces push back, they retreat into Nigeria or Chad. When operations intensify in Chad, they disperse across the porous borders that these nations share. The Multinational Joint Task Force, established specifically to address this cross-border terrorism, has struggled with coordination challenges, funding shortfalls, and the reality that effective counterterrorism requires not just military operations, but also addressing the governance voids and economic desperation that armed groups exploit for recruitment. Daily attacks on civilians occur in the cross-border areas. Government security forces restrict civilian movement and engage in military operations with limited warning, creating a situation where civilians face danger from both insurgents and the military response. The region hosts millions of displaced persons living in camps that have become semi-permanent cities of desperation, where humanitarian access is limited and armed groups sometimes operate with impunity. This is not just Nigeria's problem. This is a regional catastrophe that demands a regional response. The failure of waiting. Let me say something that will make many uncomfortable, particularly those whose comfort depends on Africa remaining in a state of managed weakness. Africa has outsourced its security for too long, outsourced it to foreign interests whose priorities are not African lives but strategic access, outsourced it to consultants who analyze violence from air-conditioned offices but do not bury our dead, outsourced it to strategies designed in rooms far from African soil by people whose understanding of our reality comes from satellite imagery and intelligence reports rather than lived experience. The Sahel provides a painful illustration of this outsourcing and its consequences. For years, France maintained substantial military presence in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger through Operation Barkhane, France's largest overseas operation involving thousands of troops and significant assets, including fighter jets, helicopters, and drone bases. The United States maintained drone operations from Niger, conducting intelligence gathering and occasional strikes against extremist targets. These foreign military presences were justified as counterterrorism operations, protecting African nations from violent extremism. Yet violence escalated even with foreign forces deployed. The presence of foreign bases created resentment among local populations who saw their sovereignty compromised. In some cases, military operations caused civilian casualties that became recruitment tools for the very extremist groups the operations were supposed to diminish. When military coups brought new governments to power in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, one of their first actions was expelling French forces and, in Niger's case, demanding the withdrawal of American forces from their drone base. These decisions were popular domestically precisely because many Africans had concluded that foreign military presence wasn't solving their security challenges, it was simply giving foreign powers bases and influence in Africa. The result was France and the United States abandoning their military bases throughout the Sahel that had been built to conduct counterterrorism missions. Billions had been spent on infrastructure, training partnerships, intelligence sharing arrangements, and in the span of months it was gone, dissolved by the political will of African governments who decided they preferred sovereignty with insecurity to foreign military presence that promised security but delivered dependence. The new architecture. And every time Africa tries to defend itself independently, we are told to slow down, to coordinate through established mechanisms that move at bureaucratic pace while people die in real time, to wait for approval from international bodies that debate endlessly while violence spreads, to defer to existing security arrangements that have manifestly failed to provide security. But terror does not wait for committee consensus. It does not respect coordination timelines. It does not pause for diplomatic processes. So the alliance I formed today is simple in its purpose. African nations defending African people on African terms. No foreign bases where other nations project power from African soil while African nations remain weak. No external command where operational decisions are made by generals accountable to distant capitals rather than to the people being protected. No permission slips where Africa must ask for authorization to defend itself. Instead, intelligence sharing so that when armed groups move across borders, all affected nations know immediately. Rapid response capabilities so that threats can be addressed before they metastasize into massacres. Border defense coordinated between nations so that what is denied entry by one country cannot simply slip across to attack another, not to occupy territories, not to dominate neighbors, not to replace anyone's sovereignty with our own, but to protect people who are dying while their governments debate and foreign powers calculate strategic interests. The Alliance of Sahel States offers a model, though not one without challenges. On December 20th, 2025, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger officially launched a joint military force of 5,000 troops to combat Islamist insurgencies and transnational crime across the Sahel. The force was inaugurated during a ceremony at an air base in Bamako, Mali's capital. Burkina Faso's military ruler, General Daouda Traoré, was named to head the force, which maintains a command base in Niamey, Niger's capital. This represented a decisive step toward regional self-defense after the three nations formally withdrew from ECOWAS in January 2025, frustrated with what they perceived as the regional body's ineffectiveness in addressing security challenges and its susceptibility to foreign influence. 2 years into the AES alliance, they moved faster than the legacy regional bloc they had left behind, creating operational military cooperation while ECOWAS was still exploring the operationalization of its standby force. The AES force is designed to conduct joint counter-terrorism operations, enhance border security, and improve intelligence sharing. It marks a philosophical shift. Rather than depending on ECOWAS or foreign partners, these Sahel nations decided to pool their own resources and coordinate their own defense, asserting that African problems require African solutions implemented by Africans. Critics pointed to the limitations. 5,000 troops is a modest force given the scale of the terrorism challenge in the Sahel. The three nations involved are themselves among the poorest in the world, limiting their military resources. Their military governments face legitimacy questions and have been accused of human rights violations in their counterterrorism operations. But supporters saw something more fundamental: African nations taking ownership of their security, refusing to wait for permission, creating facts on the ground rather than endlessly negotiating theoretical frameworks. ECOWAS and the crisis of legitimacy. Meanwhile, ECOWAS faced its own moment of truth. In December 2025, a coup attempt in Benin, one of ECOWAS's more stable democracies, triggered an immediate test of the organization's relevance. ECOWAS ordered the immediate deployment of its standby force to Benin, comprising troops from Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. Nigeria deployed ground forces and fighter jets to Cotonou, Benin's economic capital. The speed of this response stood in marked contrast to ECOWAS's slower reactions to security crises in other contexts. Some observers noted that Benin's strategic importance, including its port facilities and its role as a buffer against Sahel instability spreading to coastal West Africa, motivated the rapid intervention. Others pointed to French interests, as France had been using Benin as a fallback position after being expelled from Sahel nations, and France's counterterrorism architecture in the region would be further weakened if Benin fell to a military government likely to demand French withdrawal. On November 27, 2025, the ECOWAS Parliament had formally approved a new mutual defense and constitutional order protocol establishing what was described as a stronger and more structured security framework. The protocol authorized ECOWAS to deploy military forces in a member state without requiring the consent of the affected government in cases of unconstitutional change of government or threats to regional peace and security. This was controversial precisely because it asserted supranational authority over national sovereignty. Proponents argued it was necessary to prevent the cascade of coups that had destabilized the Sahel. Critics countered that it gave ECOWAS, and by extension its largest military power, Nigeria, effective veto over member states' internal politics. The Nigerian Senate approved ECOWAS forces deployment to Benin, demonstrating Nigeria's continued commitment to ECOWAS frameworks. But this commitment also highlighted a contradiction. Nigeria would deploy forces to Benin to prevent a coup, yet Nigeria's own territory faced security challenges that ECOWAS mechanisms had not effectively addressed. The weight of Nigerian leadership. And let me address Nigeria's people directly, because you deserve more than diplomatic abstractions. This is not an invasion. This is not a power grab designed to expand influence or extract resources. This is not a replacement for your sovereignty or a suggestion that your government should be bypassed. This is solidarity in its most concrete form, not the solidarity of statements and symbolic gestures, but the solidarity of shared risk and mutual defense. You did not ask for terror to cross your borders from Chad and Niger and Cameroon. You did not vote for the instability that has made entire regions of your country ungovernable. You did not choose to be abandoned by international partners who talk about counterterrorism while doing little to actually reduce terror. So until leadership finds its courage, and I say this not to insult but to state a hard truth, Africa will not abandon you. Your struggle is our struggle, not as rhetoric but as reality, because instability in Nigeria destabilizes the entire region. Nigeria is not small or marginal. It is Africa's most populous nation with over 200 million people. It is West Africa's largest economy. It is the traditional anchor of ECOWAS, having historically led most regional military interventions when member states faced crisis. Nigeria has peacekeeping forces deployed globally and maintains one of Africa's largest militaries. Yet despite these resources, Nigeria's internal security situation has deteriorated. This is not primarily a failure of military capacity. Nigerian forces have demonstrated capability in various theaters. It is a failure of political will, of strategy, of coordination, of prioritization. It is the result of governance challenges, corruption that diverts security spending, intelligence failures, and a strategic environment so complex that no single approach suffices. When Nigerian security forces conduct operations, they sometimes achieve tactical success. Insurgent leaders killed, weapons caches captured, territory temporarily cleared. But strategic success, the kind that translates tactical gains into lasting security, remains elusive. Armed groups adapt, regroup, and return. New groups emerge to fill voids left when others are degraded. The fundamental conditions that enable insurgency and banditry persist: ungoverned spaces, impoverished communities, grievances unaddressed, borders uncontrolled. The banditry crisis. The Northwest has become a particular nightmare, demonstrating that Nigeria's security challenges extend far beyond jihadist insurgency. Armed criminal bands dubbed bandits have effectively created zones of control where government authority is nominal at best. These groups engage in mass kidnapping for ransom, making millions of dollars by abducting students from schools, travelers from highways, villagers from their homes. In the first half of 2025, the security landscape was dominated by persistent waves of kidnapping, mass abductions, and banditry across multiple states. The Sufan Center's analysis of a mass kidnapping in November 2025 noted that alongside jihadist groups, armed criminal bandit groups have taken hold in northwestern Nigeria, increasingly adopting kidnapping as an avenue for profit. In some areas, communities report that bandits are more oppressive and dangerous than any other armed group, collecting illegal taxes, restricting movement, and executing those who resist. What makes this particularly complex is that banditry encompasses various phenomena: criminal gangs focused purely on profit, ethnic militias engaged in communal conflicts, former vigilante groups that turn to crime, and increasingly jihadist groups expanding into new territories by exploiting banditry dynamics. The Islamic State recently began operations in northwestern states including Sokoto and Kebbi, areas long plagued by bandit violence, taking advantage of the security vacuum and in some cases presenting themselves as offering protection from bandits while imposing their own harsh rule. A BBC investigation into Nigeria's security crises provided a guide to the different groups causing chaos, documenting how bandits operate with near impunity in some rural areas, how kidnapping has become industrialized with negotiators and set ransom rates, how communities pay protection money to multiple armed groups simultaneously, how some bandits have better weapons than local police, and how the motorcycle ban in several states, implemented to restrict bandit mobility, has devastated rural economies while only marginally affecting bandit operations. The Nigerian military reported that in operations during 2025, 669 terrorists and bandits were killed in the Northwest. These are significant numbers suggesting serious military engagement, yet violence continues, suggesting that while tactical operations produce body counts, strategic success in actually securing territories and populations remains elusive. Foreign intervention and its discontents. Then, in late December 2025, the United States conducted military strikes in Nigeria targeting Islamic State militants, specifically a new group called Lakurawa that had emerged in northwestern states. President Donald Trump authorized the strikes, representing the first major U.S. military operation inside Nigeria. The strikes were controversial on multiple levels. Nigerian civil society groups and some officials questioned whether Nigeria had formally authorized the strikes or whether the U.S. acted unilaterally. There were concerns about civilian casualties. In one strike, reports indicated that while militants may have been killed, the community where the strike occurred included Muslim civilians who had been targets of the very militants the U.S. claimed to be targeting. Some analysts noted that Lakurawa had emerged relatively recently and questioned whether airstrikes were an appropriate response versus intelligence-led operations by Nigerian forces. Strategically, the strikes raised questions about U.S. objectives. Was this genuine counterterrorism support, or was it establishing precedent for expanded U.S. military operations in Nigeria? The Trump administration had been explicit about seeking opportunities to project power and establish strategic positions. Nigeria's size, oil wealth, and position as West Africa's anchor made it strategically significant. Some observers worried that Nigeria could become another Sahel nation hosting U.S. military bases with all the sovereignty implications that entailed. Despite $650 million of U.S. counterterrorism aid flowing into Nigeria since 2017, the Nigerian government had not eliminated terrorism and extremism. This raised uncomfortable questions. If hundreds of millions in security assistance hadn't solved the problem, would U.S. military strikes, or would they, as in so many other contexts, create new problems while failing to solve the original ones, generating anti-American sentiment, creating martyrs for extremist recruitment, damaging U.S.-Nigerian relations, and establishing dangerous precedents about foreign military operations on Nigerian soil. A Nigerian coalition had warned in May 2024 against possible defense pacts with the U.S. and France, arguing that foreign military presence would compromise sovereignty and potentially exacerbate rather than resolve security challenges. When French and American forces withdrew from the Sahel, some African voices celebrated this as a victory for sovereignty, even while acknowledging the security challenges that remained. The lesson many Africans drew was that long-term foreign military presence doesn't solve African security problems, it creates dependency while serving foreign strategic interests. The architecture of African defense. Some will say this alliance I formed today escalates tensions. I ask them, what tension is worse than mass graves? What escalation is more serious than millions displaced? What risk is greater than children kidnapped from schools, women abducted from markets, men killed in their fields? Some will say this undermines diplomacy. I ask them, what diplomacy comforts a mother who has lost her child? What diplomatic process resurrects the villages that no longer exist? What negotiation returns the years stolen from children who grew up in IDP camps? Some will say this is dangerous. Yes, it is dangerous. Dangerous to those who profit from Africa's weakness. Dangerous to armed groups that operate across borders with impunity. Dangerous to the complacency that accepts African suffering as normal. I already know what happens next because the pattern is predictable. Western media will panic, not because Africans are dying. That barely makes international news unless the numbers are spectacular, but because Africans are organizing their own defense without seeking Western approval first. Analysts will call this reckless, using the same language they always deploy when African nations assert agency. They will warn about regional instability as if the current situation is stable. They will caution about unintended consequences while ignoring the very intended consequences of doing nothing. Diplomats will warn of consequences, by which they mean potential responses from their own governments designed to punish African initiative. They will talk about the importance of international coordination, meaning African deference to Western strategic priorities. They always do this, because they are comfortable with African instability, as long as it is managed within frameworks they control. They are comfortable when terror justifies foreign presence, creating opportunities for military bases and intelligence operations. Comfortable when chaos keeps governments dependent on foreign security assistance and thus amenable to foreign influence. Comfortable when Africa never quite stands on its own feet and thus remains a theater for great power competition rather than an actor with its own agency. But when Africans organize their own defense, when we stop asking for permission and start taking action, when we assert that our people's lives matter enough to risk making powerful entities uncomfortable, suddenly it becomes a crisis that requires international attention and potential intervention to prevent. Breaking the cycle. Let me be very clear, so there is no misunderstanding or deliberate misinterpretation. This alliance does not threaten peace. There is no peace to threaten in northeastern Nigeria where Boko Haram operates. There is no peace to threaten in northwestern Nigeria where bandits reign. There is no peace to threaten in the Lake Chad Basin where cross-border terrorism is daily reality. What exists is not peace but exhaustion, not stability but stalemate, not security but survival. This alliance threatens complacency, the complacency of international partners who express concern while providing insufficient support, the complacency of regional organizations whose mechanisms move too slowly to save lives, the complacency of analysts who treat African violence as a subject for study rather than an emergency requiring urgent action. It threatens the idea that African lives are negotiable, that some level of African suffering is acceptable, that certain numbers of African deaths are not really newsworthy, that African children matter less than children elsewhere. It threatens the old order where security is rented from foreign powers rather than owned and operated by Africans, where sovereignty is theoretical rather than practical, where African nations remain consumers of security services rather than providers of their own defense. And yes, there are red lines that this alliance establishes. Any armed group using Nigerian territory to destabilize neighboring nations will be confronted with coordinated multinational response. Any force exploiting weak borders to spread terror will be hunted across those borders through intelligence sharing and rapid reaction capabilities. Any attempt to turn Nigeria into a permanent battlefield where violence is simply managed rather than defeated will fail because Africa refuses to accept perpetual war as Nigeria's fate. Not because we seek war, no one who has seen what war does to communities and families and children seeks more war, but because we refuse surrender, we refuse to accept that nothing can be done, we refuse to believe that African nations are simply incapable of defending their own people. This is not about ego. This is not about ego or national prestige or leaders seeking military glory. It is about responsibility, the most fundamental responsibility that any government has, protecting its people from violence. Leadership is not measured by speeches about security or promises of future action. It is measured by what you actually defend when it matters most, by what you're willing to risk to protect the vulnerable, by whether you act or simply talk about acting. And if Nigeria's leaders will not defend their people decisively, if political considerations or fear of failure or concern about international reaction or bureaucratic inertia or whatever other factors are preventing decisive action, then Africa will not pretend this is none of our concern. We will not watch from across borders while Nigerians die and tell ourselves that sovereignty means we must respect the right of Nigerian leaders to fail their people without interference. Because instability in Nigeria is instability for the continent. This is not rhetorical exaggeration. This is geographic, economic, and strategic reality. Nigeria is not small or peripheral. Nigeria is the spine of West Africa. When the spine breaks, the whole body suffers. When Nigeria descends into chaos, it doesn't stay in Nigeria. It spreads. The contagion of instability. The precedents are clear and recent. Look at what happened when instability consumed Libya after 2011. Weapons flowed south into the Sahel, arming groups across the region. Fighters dispersed, bringing combat experience and extremist ideology to new theaters. Migration routes shifted, creating humanitarian crises in neighboring countries. What was a Libyan crisis became a regional catastrophe that reshaped the security landscape of an entire swath of Africa. Look at what happened when the Central African Republic collapsed into civil war. Neighboring Cameroon, Chad, and the DRC all absorbed refugees, dealt with cross-border raids, faced arms proliferation, and watched as their own internal tensions were exacerbated by the spillover. Regional organizations attempted to intervene, but the responses were slow, underfunded, and insufficient to the scale of the crisis. Look at what is happening right now in the Sahel. The security collapse in Mali didn't stay in Mali. It spread to Burkina Faso, to Niger, and is now threatening coastal West African states including Benin, Togo, and Ghana. Terrorist groups that established themselves in Mali's north are now operating hundreds of kilometers south, their expansion facilitated by porous borders, weak state presence, and the ability to move faster than regional security responses. Nigeria's crisis, if left to fester and expand, could follow the same trajectory. The Lake Chad Basin is already a regional crisis affecting 4 countries. Northwestern Nigeria's banditry connects to criminal networks operating in Niger. Southeastern Nigeria's instability has implications for Cameroon. The sheer scale of Nigeria, its population, its economy, its geographic size, means that Nigerian instability would not be containable within Nigerian borders. So today, Africa chose to act like a body, coordinated, responsive, unified in purpose, not scattered limbs each pursuing separate interests while the whole organism dies. The call to continental action. To my fellow African nations, I say this with the urgency that our moment demands. This alliance is not against you. It is not a conspiracy to diminish anyone's sovereignty or establish hegemony. It is an invitation to fundamentally change how Africa approaches security. An invitation to stop begging for security from external powers who provide just enough assistance to maintain influence, but not enough to actually solve problems. Stop exporting responsibility to foreign militaries whose primary mission is protecting their own national interests, not African lives. Stop believing that protection must come from outside Africa, that only non-African forces are capable of providing security, that we must forever remain consumers of security services rather than providers of our own defense. This invitation extends to understanding a simple but profound truth. Today, Nigeria faces this crisis. Tomorrow, it could be any one of us. Terror does not respect the borders that colonizers drew. Instability in one nation creates vulnerabilities in neighbors. Arms trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking. These transnational threats require transnational responses. If we wait until crisis reaches our own doorstep before acting, we will find ourselves in the same position Nigeria finds itself now, overwhelmed, seeking help, discovering that international assistance comes with conditions and delays and is never quite sufficient to the magnitude of the challenge. But if we act collectively when any African nation faces security catastrophe, if we establish the principle that African nations defend each other as a matter of course rather than as exceptional intervention, if we build the intelligence sharing networks and rapid reaction capabilities and border coordination mechanisms now, then we change the fundamental security dynamic of the continent. The Sahel is cautionary tale. The Sahel offers both warning and instruction. The warning is clear. Escalating violence caused fatalities linked to militant Islamist groups in Africa to surge by 60% since 2023. The Sahel now accounts for over half of global terrorism deaths, over half in a region that represents a small fraction of global population. Terrorism and violent extremism are increasingly spreading from the Sahel states to coastal West Africa, with a surge of cross-border attacks that suggest the violence is expanding geographically rather than being contained. In Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, there has been a marked increase in attacks by armed groups and terrorists throughout 2025. Counter-terrorism operations in all three states have often led to human rights violations, with security forces sometimes engaging in indiscriminate violence against communities suspected of supporting insurgents. This creates a vicious cycle. Heavy-handed military responses alienate populations, driving some toward armed groups for protection, which justifies further military operations, which generate more grievances. The continuing collapse of international counterterrorism support in the Sahel after the expulsion of French and American forces, combined with weakening leadership in regional efforts, has created a vacuum that armed groups are exploiting. Yet this vacuum also represents an opportunity for African nations to demonstrate that we can fill the security gaps ourselves, that foreign military presence was never the solution, that African security can be African-led. The instruction from the Sahel is that African coordination works when it is genuinely African, not when it is coordinated through frameworks designed in Paris or Washington, not when it depends on foreign funding that comes with strings attached, not when ultimate decision-making authority rests with non-African powers. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formed their alliance, they moved rapidly to create actual operational capability. Within 2 years, they had a joint military force conducting operations. This stands in stark contrast to decades of ECOWAS declarations about standby forces that never quite became operational. The ECOWAS challenge. ECOWAS faces a credibility crisis that this moment makes starkly visible. The organization proved it could deploy forces quickly to Benin when a coup threatened. Nigeria, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Sierra Leone moved troops across borders within days. Fighter jets were deployed. The message was clear. ECOWAS would defend constitutional order in Benin. But where was this rapid reaction capability when terrorists massacred civilians in northeastern Nigeria? Where was this coordinated multinational response when bandits conducted mass kidnappings in northwestern Nigeria? Where was this urgent deployment when millions were displaced by violence? The answer exposes an uncomfortable truth. ECOWAS can mobilize quickly for certain kinds of crises, particularly those involving unconstitutional changes of government that threaten regional stability and foreign interests, but the organization has struggled to mobilize with equal speed and effectiveness for security crises that don't fit that framework, even when those crises kill far more people and create far greater humanitarian catastrophe. This is not to say ECOWAS is useless or should be abandoned. The organization has achieved important things, particularly in mediating political disputes and maintaining some level of regional cooperation, but it is to say that ECOWAS needs fundamental reform to become the security organization that West Africa needs. Rapid, effective, focused on protecting civilians rather than primarily protecting political systems, and genuinely African-led rather than susceptible to external influence. The question of sovereignty. Some will argue that this alliance I formed today violates Nigerian sovereignty. Let me address this directly because sovereignty is sacred, but sovereignty also entails responsibility. The responsibility to protect doctrine, whatever its flaws and whatever its abuse by powerful nations to justify intervention serving their interests, rests on a kernel of truth. Sovereignty is not simply the right to be left alone. It is the responsibility to protect your population from mass atrocities. When a government cannot or will not protect its population from mass violence, when millions are displaced, when entire regions become ungovernable, when armed groups operate with effective impunity, at what point does the international community, or in this case the regional community, have not just the right but the obligation to act? I am not suggesting invasion or regime change or occupation. I am suggesting that when Nigerian civilians are being killed by armed groups that cross borders freely, neighboring nations have both the right and the responsibility to coordinate border security, share intelligence about those groups, and support Nigerian forces in confronting threats that are regional in nature. Nigerian sovereignty includes the right to request or refuse assistance, but Nigerian sovereignty also means Nigerian government has the responsibility to protect Nigerians. When that protection is manifestly failing, regional actors cannot simply cite sovereignty as an excuse for inaction while people die. The alliance I formed is structured to respect Nigerian sovereignty while providing the regional support that the scale of the crisis demands. It is not occupation, it is coordination. It is not replacing Nigerian security forces, it is augmenting their capabilities with regional intelligence and rapid reaction options. It is not imposing foreign rule, it is expressing African solidarity in its most concrete and necessary form. The false choice. There is a false choice that is often presented in these discussions. Either Africa seeks foreign assistance and accepts the dependencies and conditions that come with it, or Africa goes it alone and accepts the limitations of trying to address security challenges without external support. Either rely on French or American or other foreign military presence, or struggle with inadequate resources and capabilities. This is a false choice because it ignores a third option: African collective security, where African nations pool resources, share intelligence, coordinate operations, and build genuine continental or regional defense capabilities that are owned and operated by Africans. We don't need French bases to share intelligence about cross-border terrorism. We need working relationships between African intelligence services and the political will to share information rapidly. We don't need American drones to monitor border areas. We need African surveillance capabilities and the technical capacity to operate them, which we can build through South-South cooperation and technology transfer. We don't need foreign command structures to coordinate operations. We need African military leaders who trust each other and mechanisms that allow rapid coordination without requiring approval from distant capitals. This is not fantasy. African nations have functional militaries, intelligence services, air forces, special operations capabilities. What has been lacking is not capability but political will to use those capabilities collectively in defense of African populations. The long view. And finally, to those who still believe Africa must wait for approval before defending itself, let me end this discussion with absolute clarity. Africa has waited long enough. We have buried too many, forgiven too much, explained ourselves too often to audiences who aren't listening and don't care. We have attended too many conferences where African deaths are discussed in abstract terms, where our crises become case studies, where our suffering is analyzed but not stopped. We have read too many reports from think tanks that document our problems in detail but offer recommendations that are either impractical or serve non-African interests. We have watched too many international interventions that were supposedly designed to help us but ended up serving other agendas. 3 minutes ago, the alliance was formed. Not because we wanted to make history or challenge international order or prove a point, but because history forced our hand, because the body count forced our hand, because the IDP camps forced our hand, because the mothers who have lost children forced our hand, because the burned villages forced our hand, because our own consciences forced our hand. The new normal. Africa will defend Africa, not in theory, not in aspirational documents, not in long-term strategic plans, in practice, starting now with whatever resources we have and whatever capabilities we can pool, with permission if possible. If Nigerian leadership requests and welcomes regional support, we will coordinate closely, respecting lines of authority and ensuring Nigerian command of operations on Nigerian soil. We seek partnership, not imposition. Without permission if necessary, if bureaucratic delays or political hesitation or concerns about optics prevent timely action while people die, we will act anyway because saving lives takes precedence over diplomatic niceties. We will not let perfect coordination become the enemy of necessary action. And this time we are not asking for approval from international observers, from former colonial powers, from global institutions that move at glacial pace. We are informing them of decisions already made and actions already underway. The price of inaction. Consider what inaction has already cost. The Boko Haram insurgency began in 2009. It is now 2026, 17 years of conflict, 17 years during which hundreds of thousands have died, 17 years during which millions have been displaced, 17 years during which entire regions have been traumatized, 17 years during which international community expressed concern, provided some assistance, but never enough to actually end the crisis. Imagine if in 2010 African nations had formed an alliance like the one I am announcing today, if we had pooled intelligence, coordinated border security, established rapid reaction forces, and made clear that Boko Haram would face a united African response wherever they operated. Would the group have grown into the regional threat it became? Would ISWAP have split off and established its own territories? Would banditry have metastasized in the northwest while attention focused on the northeast? We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. The lesson is clear. Early, coordinated, determined regional action prevents crises from becoming catastrophes. Waiting for perfect conditions, waiting for consensus, waiting for international leadership, these are strategies for allowing problems to grow until they become unmanageable. The continental imperative. The African Union's principle of non-indifference to atrocities is noble, but principles require implementation. Non-indifference means more than statements. It means action. It means that when mass violence occurs anywhere in Africa, other African nations respond not because it serves their immediate national interest, but because African lives matter and African nations have collective responsibility for African security. This is not new thinking. Pan-Africanism has always held that African nations are interconnected, that colonialism divided us artificially, that our challenges are shared and therefore our responses should be shared. What is new, or should be new, is actualizing this thinking in security terms. Economic integration has advanced in Africa through regional economic communities, common markets, trade agreements. Why should security integration lag behind? Why should African nations integrate economically while remaining fragmented in terms of security? The answer is that security integration is politically harder, requires greater trust, involves risks that economic integration doesn't, but the payoff is also greater. Functional African collective security would fundamentally alter the strategic environment of the continent. It would mean that armed groups cannot simply exploit weak states as safe havens. It would mean that cross-border threats face coordinated responses. It would mean that African nations are no longer in a position where they must choose between inadequate self-defense and accepting foreign military presence. The message to armed groups. There is also a message in this alliance for the armed groups themselves, for Boko Haram, for ISWAP, for the bandits in northwestern Nigeria, for any group that uses violence against civilians. The message is simple. The era of operating across borders with impunity is ending. When you attack civilians in Nigeria and retreat to Cameroon, you will not find safety. You will find Nigerian and Cameroonian forces coordinating to locate and neutralize you. When you exploit weak border enforcement to move weapons and fighters, you will find that multiple nations are now tracking those movements and acting on that intelligence. When you calculate that no single nation has the resources or will to defeat you, you will discover that multiple nations acting collectively change that calculation fundamentally. This is not a promise of quick victory. Insurgencies and criminal networks are resilient, adaptive, and often deeply rooted in local grievances and economic conditions. Military action alone never defeats these threats. They require political solutions, economic development, governance reform, reconciliation processes. All of this remains true. But what is also true is that armed groups must face credible military pressure to bring them to negotiating tables, to prevent them from believing they can achieve their objectives through violence, to protect civilians while political processes work. That military pressure is more effective when it is coordinated, when it closes off safe havens, when it denies groups the freedom of movement they have enjoyed. The path forward. So what happens now? The alliance exists. The political decision is made. Implementation begins immediately. Intelligence services from participating nations establish direct communication channels, bypassing bureaucratic delays that have previously meant information arrived too late to be actionable. Border coordination intensifies with security forces from neighboring nations working together to monitor and control border zones that armed groups have exploited. Rapid reaction capabilities are designated, with units from multiple nations ready to deploy quickly when threats emerge that require immediate response. Simultaneously, we work with Nigerian authorities, not over them, not around them, but with them, to ensure this regional support strengthens rather than undermines Nigerian security institutions. We coordinate with ECOWAS, acknowledging the organization's legitimate role while not allowing its slower mechanisms to prevent urgent action. We communicate with international partners, explaining that our actions complement rather than replace international counterterrorism cooperation, but making clear that African leadership of African security is non-negotiable. We also, and this is crucial, address the non-military dimensions of security. We cannot kill our way out of this crisis. For every insurgent killed, armed groups recruit more from communities that lack economic opportunities, from populations that feel marginalized, from regions where government presence means military operations but not services or development. So alongside military coordination, participating nations commit to development coordination, to governance support, to addressing the root causes that make insurgency and banditry possible. The long-term vision. 5 years from now, if this alliance succeeds, northeastern Nigeria is no longer an active war zone, but an area returning to normal life, schools reopening, markets functioning, people returning to farms and businesses they had to flee. The millions of IDPs begin returning home, not because they are forced, but because security conditions genuinely improve to the point where return is possible. Northwestern Nigeria is no longer terrorized by bandits because coordinated security operations, combined with economic investment and governance reform, have addressed both the symptoms and causes of the crisis. Children attend school without fear of mass kidnapping. Travelers use highways without paying taxes to armed groups. Communities sleep without wondering if tonight is the night armed men arrive. The Lake Chad Basin is no longer a regional security catastrophe, but a region recovering with cross-border coordination between Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger having degraded armed groups to the point where they no longer control territory or threaten population centers. The massive humanitarian crisis begins to resolve as people return home and international assistance shifts from emergency aid to development support. Most importantly, the precedent is established. African nations defend African populations through African-led collective security arrangements that don't require foreign military bases or external command structures or waiting for international permission. This precedent then extends beyond West Africa, to the Horn of Africa, to Central Africa, to Southern Africa, creating a continent-wide expectation that African security is an African responsibility and African capability. The alternative. The alternative is to continue the current trajectory. Nigeria's security situation continues deteriorating, with violence spreading to regions currently relatively stable. The humanitarian catastrophe deepens, with millions more displaced and casualties mounting. Armed groups grow stronger, more entrenched, more capable, and begin exporting their brand of violence to neighboring countries more systematically. International community expresses increasing concern but provides decreasing assistance as Nigeria fatigue sets in among donors and other priorities emerge. ECOWAS continues holding meetings and passing resolutions that don't translate into effective action. Individual African nations continue pursuing their own security interests without systematic coordination, allowing armed groups to exploit the gaps. Eventually, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, the crisis reaches a point where even more drastic intervention becomes necessary, perhaps involving much larger foreign military deployments with all the sovereignty and dependency implications that entails. Or perhaps Nigeria fragments, with regions effectively seceding because the federal government cannot provide security, creating a Somalia-style failed state scenario in the heart of West Africa with catastrophic regional implications. These are not hypotheticals designed to create panic. These are plausible trajectories based on how security crises evolve when they are not addressed decisively. Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, all of these were once more functional states that descended into chaos after security crises reached tipping points. Nigeria is not yet at that point, but it is closer than it was 5 years ago, and current trends point toward worse rather than better. The moral imperative beyond strategy, beyond security analysis, beyond geopolitical calculation, there is a moral imperative that cannot be ignored. Millions of Nigerians, human beings, each with names and families and dreams and dignity, are suffering violence that they did nothing to deserve. Children are growing up traumatized, women are widowed, men are killed, entire communities are erased. In the face of this suffering, what is our moral obligation as Africans, as human beings? Is it to respect the procedural niceties of sovereignty while people die? Is it to wait for consensus while violence spreads? Is it to defer to international leadership that doesn't come? Or is it to act imperfectly with whatever resources we have, accepting risks and accepting criticism, because saving lives matters more than diplomatic comfort? I believe it is the latter. I believe that when you have the capability to reduce suffering and you choose not to act because acting is complicated or risky or might offend some parties, you are complicit in that suffering. Not legally complicit, perhaps, but morally complicit. This alliance is, at its core, a moral statement. African lives matter enough to risk complications, to accept criticism, to challenge norms that serve inaction rather than protection. The final word. 3 minutes ago, the alliance was formed, not because we wanted history, but because history forced our hand. Not because we sought glory, but because we could not in good conscience remain passive. Not because we are certain of success, but because we are certain that doing nothing guarantees failure. Africa will defend Africa, with permission if possible, without permission if necessary. And this time we are not asking, we are acting, we are coordinating, we are deploying, we are sharing intelligence, we are securing borders, we are protecting civilians. The world can accept this or condemn it. Partners can support this or oppose it. Analysts can praise this or critique it. But it is happening, starting now, because Nigerian lives are worth defending and African nations are capable of defending them. The reckoning with dependency. To those who profit from African weakness, who benefit from our dependency, who prefer us divided and requesting help rather than united and providing our own defense, your era is ending. Not through rhetoric, but through action. Not in theory, but in practice. For too long, there has been an entire ecosystem that thrives on African inability to solve African problems. Consulting firms that charge millions to produce reports about our security challenges while offering little practical solution. Defense contractors who see African instability as market opportunity, selling weapons and training packages that address symptoms without curing disease. International organizations whose budgets depend on perpetual crisis requiring their intervention. Media outlets whose coverage of Africa focuses almost exclusively on conflict, corruption, and catastrophe because stability doesn't generate clicks. This ecosystem has a vested interest in Africa remaining just unstable enough to require intervention, but never stable enough to become self-sufficient, just weak enough to need external support, but never strong enough to reject terms that come with that support. Just divided enough that continental coordination seems impossible, but not so fractured that complete chaos threatens global interests. We see this pattern repeated across contexts. When African nations assert sovereignty over resources, it's called resource nationalism with negative connotation, while Western nations doing identical things call it economic security. When African nations coordinate military responses, it's called escalation, while NATO expansion is called collective defense. When African leaders make decisions that serve African interests but inconvenience external powers, those leaders become subjects of negative media campaigns, their governance is questioned, their legitimacy is challenged. But the fundamental calculation is changing. The generation of African leaders currently emerging remembers the failures of the past but isn't bound by them. We watched what happened when our predecessors trusted foreign promises and got dependency instead of development. We studied how resources flowed out while poverty remained. We learned that sovereignty isn't given, it's taken, exercised, defended. This alliance represents that generational shift made manifest. We are not asking whether it's acceptable to defend Nigerian civilians without following protocols designed to slow action and maintain external control. We are doing it and informing the world after the decision is made, not seeking approval before implementation. To true partners, to those who genuinely want African security and prosperity, who believe in African agency and capability, who understand that helping Africa sometimes means stepping back and allowing Africans to lead, partner with us, share technology that enhances our surveillance and intelligence capabilities, provide intelligence about transnational threats that your systems detect, offer support in training and logistics where we have two true partners. To those who genuinely want African security and prosperity, who believe in African agency and capability, who understand that helping Africa sometimes means stepping back and allowing Africans to lead, partner with us, share technology that enhances our surveillance and intelligence capabilities, provide intelligence about transnational threats that your systems detect, offer support in training and logistics where we have gaps to fill. But do so knowing that we are leading this effort, we are making the decisions, we are commanding our forces, we are accountable to our populations. Partnership means mutual respect, not patronage. It means supporting our priorities, not redirecting them toward yours. It means accepting that sometimes African solutions look different from Western approaches, and different doesn't mean wrong. There are nations and institutions that understand this distinction. Countries that have provided military assistance without demanding bases in return, organizations that have shared intelligence without requiring that we structure our operations according to their preferences, partners who have offered training without insisting that we adopt their entire military doctrine regardless of whether it fits our context. These are the partnerships we value and will deepen. These are the relationships built on mutual benefit rather than dependency. These are the collaborations where African agency is respected rather than merely tolerated, but we also recognize that true partnership requires that we bring something to the table beyond need. For too long, African nations approached security cooperation from positions of weakness, asking for help because we couldn't manage alone. This created relationships where we had little leverage, where we accepted terms because refusal meant having nothing. The alliance changes this dynamic. When African nations coordinate effectively, when we demonstrate capability to manage our own security challenges, when we show that we can operate collectively without external command, we become more attractive partners, not less, because capable partners who choose to collaborate are more valuable than dependent clients who have no choice. The promise to the suffering. To Nigerians suffering violence, help is coming, not foreign intervention that serves other interests first and yours secondarily, if at all, not international peacekeepers who arrive late after the worst has already happened and leave early when their mandates expire or funding runs short, not humanitarian agencies that can only treat symptoms because they're prohibited from addressing causes. This is African solidarity, concretely expressed through intelligence sharing that helps Nigerian forces locate threats before they can strike, through border coordination that prevents armed groups from escaping across borders when Nigerian military operations pressure them, through rapid reaction capability when crisis emerges that requires immediate response beyond what any single nation can provide alone. We know that trust has been broken before. You've heard promises from your own government that weren't kept. You've heard international community pledge support that proved inadequate. You've been told that solutions were coming, that security was improving, that normalcy would return, and then violence continued. Displacement increased, hope diminished. So we don't ask you to simply trust. We ask you to watch what we do, not what we say. In the coming weeks and months, you will see whether this alliance translates into actual change on the ground, whether coordination between African security forces makes it harder for armed groups to operate with impunity, whether intelligence sharing leads to operations that disrupt terrorist networks before they can attack, whether border security improvements reduce the flow of weapons and fighters that has sustained insurgency. If we fail to deliver tangible improvements, you have every right to dismiss this as more empty rhetoric. But if we succeed, if security gradually improves, if displaced persons begin returning home, if communities start rebuilding, if hope returns, then you will know that African solidarity is not just concept but reality. We are under no illusions about the difficulty of what we're attempting. Boko Haram and ISWAP are experienced, resourceful adversaries who have survived years of military operations. The bandit networks in the Northwest are deeply entrenched in local economies and social structures. The factors that enable insurgency and criminality, poverty, marginalization, weak governance, environmental stress, cannot be addressed by military means alone. But what we can do is create space for solutions by degrading armed groups' ability to operate freely, by demonstrating that violence will face coordinated response, by showing that African nations will defend African civilians. Military operations buy time and create conditions for political, economic, and social solutions to take root. That is what this alliance offers, not a silver bullet, but a fighting chance. The practical reality: the signature is more than dry, the ink has set, the document exists, but more importantly than any piece of paper, the operational reality has begun. The maps are marked, not just general areas, but specific border zones where coordination will intensify, routes that armed groups use for movement and logistics, locations where intelligence suggests high-value targets operate. The forces are designated, not the entire militaries of participating nations, which remain responsible for their own territorial defense, but specialized units prepared for rapid deployment, intelligence personnel embedded with counterpart services, liaison officers establishing real-time communication channels, logistics coordinators ensuring that when joint operations are required, they can be executed without the delays that have previously plagued regional military cooperation. The intelligence channels are open, secure communications allowing analysts from multiple nations to share information instantly, cutting through the bureaucratic processes that previously meant intelligence arrived too late to be actionable. When a Nigerian intelligence service learns something about a threat that involves cross-border elements, that information now reaches Cameroonian, Chadian, and Nigerian counterparts within hours, not weeks. When satellite imagery or signals intelligence reveals suspicious activity in border regions, all relevant nations receive it simultaneously. The coordination has begun, not with large visible troop movements that would be obvious and potentially inflammatory, but with the quiet technical work that makes effective security cooperation possible. Officers exchanging information about armed group movements, analysts comparing notes on recruitment patterns, planners wargaming scenarios for joint operations if they become necessary. This is not the coordination of press releases and photo opportunities. This is operational coordination built for effectiveness rather than visibility, designed to produce results rather than headlines. The response, not the statement. Nigeria is bleeding, but Africa is responding, not with statements of concern that express sympathy while delivering nothing practical, not with emergency meetings that produce communiques but no action, not with promises of future support that never quite materializes when needed. This response is solidarity made concrete through coordinated action that puts African military and intelligence capabilities in service of protecting African civilians. It is the operationalization of the principle that African security is African responsibility. It is the transformation of Pan-African rhetoric into Pan-African reality. And it sends a clear message to everyone watching: the era when African crises could only be addressed through external intervention is ending. The era when African nations accepted whatever terms foreign powers offered because we believed we had no alternatives is over. The era when African sovereignty was theoretical rather than practical is concluding. We are not rejecting international cooperation. We are redefining its terms. We are not isolating ourselves from global security architecture. We are determining how we fit within it on our terms rather than accepting the subordinate position others designed for us. History's judgment. History will judge whether we succeed. This is certain. Historians will analyze this moment, assess whether the alliance achieved its objectives, evaluate whether African collective security proved viable or whether it failed and vindicated those who said Africa couldn't manage its own defense. But regardless of the ultimate outcome, history will not judge us for failing to try. It will not record that we stood by while Nigerians suffered and did nothing because taking action was difficult or risky or politically complicated. It will not say that we saw the catastrophe unfolding and chose inaction because coordination was hard or because some parties might object or because we feared failure more than we feared irrelevance. The attempt itself matters, even if success is not guaranteed, because attempting and failing teaches lessons that benefit future efforts, because demonstrating the will to act shifts expectations about what African nations are capable of and willing to do, because even imperfect action that saves some lives is better than perfect inaction that saves none. We may fail. The armed groups may prove more resilient than our coordination. Political differences between participating nations may undermine military cooperation. Resource constraints may limit what we can achieve. The complexity of Nigeria's security challenges may exceed our collective capacity to address them, but we may also succeed. The coordination may prove effective enough to significantly degrade armed groups' operational capabilities. The intelligence sharing may prevent attacks and save lives. The rapid reaction capability may respond to crises before they become catastrophes. The demonstration that African nations can coordinate effective security operations may inspire similar arrangements in other regions facing similar challenges. We won't know unless we try, and 3 minutes ago we decided to try. The beginning, not the end. The alliance is formed. Africa defends Africa, starting now. These are not concluding words, they are opening statements. What follows will determine whether this alliance becomes a model for African collective security or a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding capability. But the decision is made, the commitment is given, the operations have begun, and whatever comes next, it comes with African nations having asserted that our people's lives are worth defending, that we possess the capability to provide that defense, that sovereignty means not just the right to be left alone, but the power to protect our populations. Nigeria is bleeding, but the bleeding will not continue unopposed, unanswered, unaddressed by African nations who possess the means to help and have now found the will to act. 3 minutes ago changed what comes next. Not through magic or miracle, but through decision backed by capability and commitment backed by coordination. Africa defends Africa, not as aspiration, as fact, starting now.